Hello everyone, welcome to the Mysterious Stories channel, where you'll discover the most mysterious, scary, and fascinating stories. Make sure to turn up the volume and get ready for a spine-chilling experience you won't forget.
The Watchman's Curse, Episode 1, The First Chime. The old clock tower loomed over the small, desolate town like a sentinel frozen in time. Its rusted gears and cracked faceplate seemed to sneer at those who dared glance its way. No one went near it after sunset, not since the stories began. The tales of the Watchman. Claire, an aspiring journalist, arrived in town late one autumn afternoon, the air heavy with the scent of damp leaves and decay. She had heard whispers of the clock tower's curse, of the shadowy figure that walked its circular corridors at night. The locals called him the Watchman, a ghostly keeper said to haunt the tower, cursed to walk its halls for eternity. Armed with her camera and a determination to uncover the truth, Claire checked into the lone inn and began asking questions. The innkeeper, a wrinkled man with clouded eyes, shook his head at her inquiries. "It's not a story you'll want to chase, miss," he warned, his voice low and gravelly. "The Watchman doesn't like visitors." Undeterred, Claire pressed on, noting the way the townsfolk avoided her gaze when she mentioned the tower. Their fear was palpable, but she couldn't let it stop her. That night, she packed her equipment and made her way to the base of the clock tower. The tower's entrance was marked by a heavy wooden door, its iron hinges weathered with age. Claire pushed it open, the creak echoing through the silent night. Inside, the air was stale, carrying the faint metallic scent of rust. A spiral staircase wound upwards, disappearing into darkness. Claire took a deep breath and ascended, her flashlight casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. The higher she climbed, the colder it became. Her breath puffed out in small white clouds, and the sound of her footsteps seemed muted, swallowed by the oppressive silence. When she reached the top, she found herself in the clock chamber. The enormous gears were still, their surfaces coated in a thick layer of dust, but something felt wrong. The air seemed to hum with a faint vibration, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Then she saw him. A shadow moved along the far wall, distinct and deliberate. Claire's breath hitched as she raised her camera, snapping a photo. The flash illuminated the room for a split second, revealing nothing but empty space. But when she lowered the camera, the shadow was closer. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling. The shadow didn't respond. Instead, the clock's gears groaned to life, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. The hands of the clock began to move, spinning faster and faster until they were a blur. The first chime rang out, deep and resonant, shaking the walls of the tower. Claire stumbled back, covering her ears as the sound reverberated through her skull. The shadow coalesced into the shape of a man, tall and imposing, his face obscured by darkness. He raised a hand, pointing directly at her. "Leave," a voice whispered, though his lips did not move. The sound was everywhere and nowhere, filling the room like a cold wind. Claire bolted, nearly tripping over the steps in her haste to escape. The chimes followed her, each one louder than the last, until she burst out into the cool night air. She collapsed onto the grass, her chest heaving as the final chime echoed into the silence. When she looked back at the tower, the shadow of the Watchman stood in the highest window, watching her. She scrambled to her feet and ran, the image burned into her mind. Back at the inn, Claire reviewed the photos on her camera. Most were empty, showing only the dusty interior of the tower, but one sent chills down her spine. In the corner of the frame was the faint outline of a man, his eyes glowing like embers. Claire knew she had found her story, but she also knew she hadn't seen the last of the Watchman. Episode 2, The Second Chime. Claire's hands trembled as she stared at the photograph on her laptop screen. The faint outline of the Watchman seemed almost alive, his glowing eyes piercing through the grainy image. She couldn't sleep that night, every creak of the old inn sent her heart racing. But as the sun rose, so did her resolve. She needed answers. She spent the day in the town's library, a musty room filled with faded books and forgotten records. After hours of searching, she stumbled upon an old journal belonging to a man named Edgar Wren, the clockmaker, who had built the tower. The entries were fragmented, but one passage caught her attention. The Watchman's curse binds him to the tower until the sins of the past are atoned for. Each chime marks a warning, but few listen. The shadow grows restless, seeking what was lost. What sins, what had been lost? The journal offered no further clues, but Claire's curiosity burned brighter. She decided to return to the tower, this time prepared. She packed extra batteries, a notepad, and a small tape recorder, determined to document every detail. The tower was even more foreboding in the twilight, its silhouette stark against the bruised purple sky. Claire's footsteps echoed as she crossed the overgrown courtyard. She hesitated at the door, a chill running down her spine, before pushing it open once more. This time, she climbed with purpose, ignoring the cold that seeped through her jacket. When she reached the clock chamber, the air was heavy with tension, as if the room itself was holding its breath. The gears were still, but the silence felt alive. Claire set up her recorder and began speaking, her voice steady despite her fear. "I'm inside the clock tower. It's just after sunset. There's a presence here, the watchman. If you can hear me, I want to help." For a moment, there was nothing. Then, the faint sound of footsteps echoed through the chamber. Claire's heart pounded as she scanned the room, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The shadow appeared again, moving closer with every flicker of light. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The gears groaned to life once more, and the clock hands spun wildly. The second chime rang out, deeper and more resonant than before. Claire dropped to her knees, covering her ears as the sound reverberated through her body. The shadow loomed over her, its form more distinct now. She could see the outline of a uniform, a glint of a badge. "Seek the ledger," the voice whispered, cold and hollow. "The sins are written there." Before Claire could respond, the shadow dissipated, and the room fell silent. She gasped for air, her hands shaking as she scrambled to her feet. The recorder had stopped, its tape inexplicably jammed. Claire didn't wait to see if the watchman would return. She fled the tower, the second chime still echoing in her mind. Back at the inn, she searched for any mention of a ledger in the town's history but found nothing. Whatever the watchman wanted her to find, it wasn't going to be easy. But Claire knew one thing, she couldn't stop now. The watchman's curse was unraveling, and she was determined to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. Episode 3, the final chime. Claire's search for the ledger consumed her. Days blurred into nights, as she scoured every dusty corner of the library and questioned every reluctant townsperson. Finally, a frail woman named Marjorie, who had lived in the town her whole life, offered a clue. "The ledger," Marjorie whispered, her voice shaking. "It's buried beneath the tower. Edgar hid it there to protect us, but it brought nothing but ruin." Claire's heart raced. The answers she sought were within reach. That night, she returned to the tower, a shovel and flashlight in hand. The courtyard was eerily quiet, the wind still as if the world itself was holding its breath. She began digging at the base of the tower, the soil damp and heavy. Hours passed, and her muscles burned with exertion, but she didn't stop. Finally, her shovel struck something solid. She unearthed a small, iron-bound chest. Her hands trembled as she opened it, revealing a weathered ledger, its pages yellowed with age. The moment she touched it, the air around her grew colder. A low, guttural hum resonated from the tower. She flipped through the ledger, her breath hitching as she read the names listed within. Each entry detailed a crime, betrayals, thefts, even murders committed by the town's ancestors. The watchman had been their victim, betrayed and left to die when he tried to expose their sins. As the truth sank in, the tower's gears roared to life. The clock's hands spun wildly, and the final chime rang out, a sound so loud and piercing it felt like the earth itself would split. The watchman appeared before her, his form more solid than ever, his eyes burning with fury. "You have done what they would not," he said, his voice a mix of gratitude and sorrow. "The curse is lifted, but the price must be paid." Before Claire could react, the ground beneath her feet crumbled. She screamed as she fell into darkness, the ledger clutched. The Stranger in the Window, Chapter 1, The First Glimpse. Emily sat in her small apartment on the 14th floor, her laptop illuminating her tired face as rain tapped against the windows. The city skyline stretched beyond her, a sea of lights glimmering in the storm. It was past midnight, and the hum of the city had dwindled into a low murmur. The isolation of her high-rise sanctuary was comforting until it wasn't. She stretched, rubbing her neck, and moved to pour herself another cup of tea. Her reflection caught her eye as she passed the large glass window. Something about it made her pause. For a moment, she thought she saw another face, a pale, shadowy figure standing just behind her own reflection. But when she turned around, the room was empty. Emily laughed nervously, shaking her head. "Too many horror movies," she muttered, trying to brush off the unease. She returned to her laptop and buried herself in work. An hour later, the sensation returned, the feeling of being watched. Her eyes flicked to the window. She froze. Outside, pressed against the glass, was a face. Pale, gaunt, and staring directly at her. The eyes were hollow, the lips twisted into a faint, eerie smile. Emily's breath caught in her throat. Her apartment was 14 floors up. There was no balcony, no ledge. She blinked, and the face was gone. The rain smeared the window where it had been, as if something had slid down the glass. She stumbled backward, her pulse racing, picking up her phone. She dialed her best friend, Megan. "Hey, Megan answered grudgingly. "It's late. What's up?" "There's someone outside my window," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. Megan's tone sharpened. "What? Are you sure?" "Yes. I think so. I don't know how, though. I'm on the 14th floor. It's probably a reflection or something." "You've been working too hard," Megan said, though her voice carried a note of concern. "Just close the curtains and get some sleep. I'll come by in the morning." Reluctantly, Emily nodded, realizing Megan couldn't see her. "Okay, thanks." She ended the call and pulled the curtains shut, blocking out the storm and the unsettling void beyond. Crawling into bed, she kept the lights on, every creak and groan of the building making her flinch. That night, sleep was elusive. She kept imagining the face, its empty eyes and haunting smile. When she finally drifted off, her dreams were filled with shadows clawing at the windows, whispering her name. The next morning, Emily awoke to sunlight streaming through the edges of her curtains. She cautiously opened them, half expecting to see the figure still there. But the window was clear, the city below bustling with life as if nothing had happened. Trying to shake off the night's terror, Emily went about her day. But the feeling lingered, a heavy weight pressing against her chest. She couldn't escape the thought someone, or something, had been watching her. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the city lights began to flicker, Emily sat with her curtains drawn tight. Her laptop sat closed, her tea sat untouched. The room felt suffocatingly quiet, and then the knocking began. Chapter 2: The Shadows Return. Emily stared at the closed curtains, her heart pounding in her chest. The knocks had been unmistakable, reverberating through the quiet room like a sinister invitation. She wanted to convince herself it was just her imagination or a branch hitting the window, but her apartment was too high for such mundane explanations. Summoning all her courage, she approached the window, each step feeling heavier than the last. Her hand trembled as she reached for the curtain. Slowly, she pulled it aside. The glass was empty. The rain had stopped, leaving behind streaks of water that glistened in the city lights. Emily let out a shaky breath, relief washing over her. But just as she was about to let the curtain fall back into place, she noticed something. On the outside of the window, faintly etched into the condensation, were 3 words. "Let me in." Her blood ran cold. The letters were smeared and uneven, as if traced by a finger. She stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the coffee table. Her phone was on the couch where she had left it. Grabbing it, she dialed Megan again, her hands shaking so badly she almost dropped the device. "Megan, it's back," she blurted out as soon as her friend picked up. "What? Slow down," Megan said, her voice groggy but alert. "What's back? The face? The thing outside my window. It wrote something on the glass. I don't know what to do." Megan's tone turned serious. "Emily, listen to me. Don't panic. Do you have neighbors close by? Someone who can come check?" Emily shook her head, even though Megan couldn't see her. "No, I don't really know anyone in this building. Megan, I'm scared." "I'm coming over," Megan said firmly. "Stay on the phone with me until I get there." Emily nodded, clutching the phone like a lifeline. She sat on the couch, her eyes darting between the window and the locked front door. Megan's voice was a steady presence, calming her as minutes dragged into what felt like hours. Finally, there was a knock at the door. Emily jumped, her pulse spiking. "It's me," Megan called from the other side. Emily rushed to unlock the door, nearly collapsing into her friend's arms. Megan held her tightly, her expression a mix of concern and determination. "Show me," Megan said, guiding Emily back to the living room. Emily hesitated, then pulled the curtain aside once more. The writing was still there, faint but undeniable. Megan's eyes widened. "Okay," Megan said, her voice steady. "We're not staying here tonight. Pack a bag. You're coming to my place." Emily didn't argue. She gathered a few essentials, her hands trembling as she stuffed them into a backpack. Megan stayed by the window, her gaze fixed on the glass as if daring the figure to return. As they left the apartment, Emily glanced back one last time. The window was dark, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching her leave. Chapter 3. The Final Revelation. The ride to Megan's place was tense, silence filling the car except for the occasional murmur of the radio. Emily stared out the window, her eyes darting between the city lights, half expecting to see the face reflected in the car's glass. When they arrived, Megan locked the door behind them and led Emily to the living room. "We'll figure this out tomorrow," she said, handing Emily a blanket and a cup of tea. "For now, just try to rest." But rest didn't come easily. As Emily sat curled up on the couch, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak of the house, every shadow that shifted in the dim light, set her nerves on edge. Around 3 a.m., the silence was broken by a faint tapping sound. Emily froze, her breath hitching. It was coming from the living room window. Megan, who had been dozing in a chair, woke with a start at Emily's gasp. "What is it?" Megan whispered. Emily pointed to the window, her hand trembling. Slowly, Megan stood and approached it. She pulled back the curtain, revealing nothing but the quiet street outside. "There's nothing there," Megan said, turning back to Emily. But as she spoke, a chilling voice echoed through the room. "You can't leave me behind," Emily screamed, clutching the blanket as the voice seemed to swirl around them, growing louder. Megan backed away from the window, her face pale. The lights in the room flickered, plunging them into brief moments of darkness. When the light steadied, the words "let me in" were etched across every window in the house. Megan grabbed Emily's hand. "We're leaving, now," she shouted, pulling her toward the front door. But as they reached for the knob, the door refused to budge. It was as if an invisible force held it shut. Panic set in. Emily banged on the door while Megan frantically tried to unlock it. The room grew colder, their breaths visible in the dim light. The voice returned, whispering now, but no less menacing. "You let me in once. You belong to me now." Emily's mind raced. "What do you want?" She cried out, her voice cracking. Silence. And then, the whisper, "Look." Emily and Megan turned toward the living room. The figure stood there, pale and hollow-eyed, its smile stretched impossibly wide. It pointed to Emily, and in that moment, she understood. This was no ordinary haunting, it was something far older, far darker. Emily screamed as the figure surged forward, and the lights went out completely. They found the house abandoned weeks later. Megan and Emily were gone, but the words "let me in" remained etched into. The Siren's Call, Episode 1, The Song on the Wind. The small coastal town of Ravenshire had always been shrouded in mist, a place where the line between land and sea blurred. Fishing boats dotted the harbor, their wooden hulls groaning against the tide. The locals whispered of a melody that drifted on the wind during stormy nights, a haunting tune that promised solace but delivered despair. Evelyn Marlowe, a marine biologist, arrived in Ravenshire for research on the mysterious marine life rumored to dwell in the area. She was skeptical of the tales, dismissing them as old sailors' superstitions. Her focus was on studying a rare species of bioluminescent jellyfish that had been sighted near the cliffs. The first night in town, Evelyn sat in her rented cottage, the rhythmic crash of waves lulling her into a sense of calm. As the wind picked up, carrying the scent of salt and seaweed, she heard it, a soft, ethereal song that seemed to float just beyond her comprehension. It was beautiful, yet unsettling, like a lullaby sung in a language she couldn't understand. Curious, Evelyn stepped outside into the foggy night. The melody seemed to beckon her toward the cliffs, where the waves pounded against jagged rocks. Her heart raced as she followed the sound, her rational mind struggling to explain its source. She reached the edge and peered down, but the swirling mist obscured the water below. "It's just the wind," she told herself, retreating to the safety of her cottage. But sleep eluded her, the haunting melody looping in her mind. The next morning, Evelyn visited the local pub, hoping to learn more about the song. The patrons fell silent when she mentioned it, exchanging uneasy glances. Finally, an old fisherman named Garrett spoke up. "The song ain't for the likes of us," he said, his voice rough as sandpaper. "It's the sirens. They lure you in, make you forget who you are. Those who follow it don't come back." Evelyn dismissed his warning but couldn't shake the unease that settled over her. Determined to uncover the truth, she ventured to the cliffs again that night, armed with her recording equipment. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the song returned, weaving through the darkness like a thread of silver. This time, she recorded it, the haunting notes captured on tape. But as she played it back, something strange happened. The melody seemed to shift, growing louder, as if responding to her presence. The air grew colder, the mist thicker. Shadows moved at the edge of her vision, and the feeling of being watched became unbearable. Evelyn fled back to her cottage, her heart pounding. Listening to the recording again, she noticed something she hadn't heard before, a faint voice beneath the melody, whispering her name. The realization sent a chill down her spine. The song wasn't just a natural phenomenon. It was something alive, something that had noticed her. Episode 2, Beneath the Waves. Evelyn couldn't shake the memory of the song or the whisper that seemed to call her name. Over the following days, she became obsessed with uncovering the truth. She analyzed the recording repeatedly, isolating frequencies and searching for any logical explanation. But the more she dissected the sound, the more it seemed to defy reason. The voice beneath the melody grew clearer with each listen, until it wasn't just whispering her name, it was pleading. "Help me," the words echoed in her mind, filling her with a strange mix of dread and curiosity. Who was calling to her, and why? She knew she couldn't ignore it any longer. On her next trip to the cliffs, Evelyn brought diving gear. If the song was coming from the sea, she would find its source. Garrett caught sight of her loading the equipment into her car and tried to stop her. "You don't understand what you're dealing with," he warned. "The ocean keeps its secrets for a reason. Don't go looking for something you can't handle." But Evelyn was resolute. She had spent her life unraveling mysteries of the deep, and this would be no different. The song had become a puzzle she was determined to solve, no matter the cost. The sun was setting by the time she reached the cliffs. The melody was already drifting through the air, weaving its spell. She descended the rocky path to a secluded cove, where the water glowed faintly under the light of the moon. Donning her gear, she slipped beneath the surface, the cold shock of the water stealing her breath. As she swam deeper, the song grew louder, enveloping her in its haunting embrace. The bioluminescent jellyfish she had come to study floated around her like ethereal lanterns, their glow illuminating the dark expanse of the sea. But as beautiful as they were, they couldn't distract her from the sense that she was being watched. Her flashlight beam cut through the water, revealing the rocky seabed below. Among the shadows, something glinted, a structure, half buried in sand. It looked ancient, its surface covered in intricate carvings that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly light. Drawn closer, Evelyn reached out to touch it, and the song abruptly stopped. The silence was deafening, pressing in on her from all sides. Then, the carvings began to shift, forming patterns that seemed almost human. A face emerged, its eyes opening to meet hers. A voice filled her mind, drowning out her thoughts. "You should not have come." Panic surged through her as the structure began to tremble, the sand swirling around it like a storm. She kicked upward, desperate to escape, but something brushed against her leg. Looking down, she saw tendrils of darkness reaching for her, pulling her back toward the structure. The last thing she saw before everything went black was the face in the carvings, its expression one of sorrow and warning. Episode 3, The Siren's Embrace. Evelyn awoke to the sensation of weightlessness. She was suspended in an otherworldly chamber, its walls shimmering like liquid glass. The melody surrounded her, now softer but no less haunting. Figures moved in the shadows, their forms indistinct yet undeniably human. You heard our call, a voice echoed, resonating in her mind rather than her ears. Evelyn turned, finding herself face to face with a figure that seemed carved from the sea itself. Its features were both beautiful and terrifying, its eyes fathomless pools of dark water. "Who are you?" Evelyn managed to whisper, her voice trembling. "We are the Forgotten," the figure replied, "bound to the depths by those who feared our power. The song is our cry for freedom." Evelyn's heart pounded as the figure's words sank in. "What do you want from me? You are the first to listen," it said. "The first to come willingly. You can break the chains that bind us." Evelyn's rational mind screamed at her to refuse, to find a way out of this nightmare. But the melody now woven with voices begging for release pierced her heart. Against her better judgment, she asked, "How?" The figure extended a hand, its surface rippling like water. "Give yourself to the depths. Become one with us, and the bonds will shatter." Fear and pity wired within her. She thought of Garrett's warning, of the countless stories of those who followed the song and never returned. But she also saw the sorrow in the figure's eyes, the desperation of a being trapped for eternity. With trembling hands, Evelyn reached out. The moment their hands touched, a surge of cold engulfed her, pulling her into the figure's embrace. The chamber dissolved around her, replaced by a torrent of memories not her own. She saw the sirens as they once were guardians of the sea, betrayed and cast into darkness by those who sought to control them. As the visions faded, Evelyn found herself back at the cliffs, the ocean calm and silent. The song was gone, replaced by an eerie stillness. She looked down at her hands, now marked with faint, glowing patterns. She was no longer just Evelyn Marlowe. She was something more, something bound to the sea and its secrets. In the distance, Garrett watched from the shadows, his expression grim. He turned away, muttering under his breath. Another one lost. The Endless Hotel, Episode 1. Check-in. The rain fell in heavy sheets as Sarah drove down the dark, winding road. Her car's headlights struggled to pierce the storm, and the GPS on her phone had long stopped working. She had been driving for hours, searching for a place to stay, when she spotted a flickering neon sign in the distance. Endless Hotel, vacancy. Relieved, Sarah pulled into the small, cracked parking lot. The building was old but well-kept, its facade illuminated by a dim yellow glow from the lobby. She grabbed her bag and dashed inside, the bell above the door jingling as she entered. The lobby was quiet, almost too quiet. A faint smell of mildew lingered in the air, and the wallpaper, once vibrant, was now faded and peeling. Behind the desk stood a tall, thin man in an immaculate black suit. His eyes were sharp and cold, yet his smile was polite. "Welcome," he said, his voice smooth and practiced. "Do you have a reservation?" "No," Sarah replied, brushing rainwater from her jacket. "I'm just looking for a place to stay for the night. My car's GPS isn't working, and I'm completely lost." The man nodded, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. "We always have room for travelers." "Just one night." Sarah hesitated but nodded. "Yes, just one night." He slid a ledger across the counter, along with an old-fashioned fountain pen. The page she signed on looked strangely blank, as if no one had ever written on it before. The pen's ink flowed smoothly, and Sarah noticed her name seemed to sink into the paper, becoming darker than expected. "Room 307, the man said, handing her a key, a real, metal key, not a key card. "Enjoy your stay." The elevator creaked as it ascended. The air inside felt heavy, and the mirrored walls seemed to distort her reflection ever so slightly. When the doors opened on the third floor, the hallway stretched out before her, unnaturally long and dimly lit by flickering sconces. The patterned carpet seemed to ripple under her feet as she walked. Room 307 was at the far end of the hallway. The key turned smoothly in the lock, and Sarah stepped inside. The room was modest but clean, with a single bed, a small desk, and a window that overlooked nothing. The glass was clouded and opaque, as though the storm outside had swallowed the view. She set her bag down and sat on the bed. Despite the strange atmosphere, she felt exhaustion overtaking her. But as she lay back, a faint knock echoed through the room. It wasn't at the door, but seemed to come from within the walls. "Hello," she called, sitting upright. The knocking stopped. Shaking her head, Sarah dismissed it as her imagination. The storm outside howled, and she decided to distract herself by exploring the hotel. Maybe a hot drink from the lobby would help her relax. The hallway was eerily quiet as she stepped out of her room. She pressed the elevator button, but the light didn't come on. Deciding to take the stairs instead, she found a door marked stairs and pushed it open. The stairwell was dark, the air damp and cold. As she descended, the sound of her footsteps echoed strangely, as if someone else were following her. When she reached the ground floor, she stepped into the lobby, but it wasn't the same. The furniture was covered in dust sheets, and the air was stale. The front desk was empty, the ledger and fountain pen gone. Panic gripped her as she called out, "Hello, is anyone here?" Her voice echoed unnaturally, swallowed by the oppressive silence. She turned back toward the stairs, but the door she had come through was now gone, replaced by a blank stretch of wall. Heart pounding, Sarah ran to the elevator and pressed the button. This time, it opened immediately, and she stepped inside, slamming the button for the third floor. The elevator groaned to life, but instead of stopping at her floor, it continued to descend, deeper and deeper. When the doors finally opened, Sarah was greeted by a long, dimly lit corridor. The air was colder here, and a faint hum filled her ears. She stepped out, the elevator doors closing behind her with a finality that made her stomach drop. The corridor stretched endlessly in both directions. Doors lined the walls, each identical and numbered in no discernible order. A soft, rhythmic knocking came from behind several of them, growing louder the longer she stood there. "This isn't real," she whispered, gripping her bag tightly. But as she took a step forward, the lights flickered, and a shadow moved at the far end of the hallway. Sarah froze, her breath catching in her throat. The shadow grew larger, advancing toward her with slow, deliberate steps. She turned and ran, her footsteps echoing as doors creaked open around her, whispers spilling out into the hallway. Reaching the end of the corridor, she found another staircase. Without thinking, she bolted down it, her heart pounding as the whispers turned into distant laughter. When she reached the bottom, she pushed through another door, praying it would lead her back to the lobby. Instead, she found herself back in room 307. The bed was neatly made, her bag sitting where she had left it. But the window was no longer clouded. Now, it revealed a vast, black void, pinpricks of light twinkling like distant stars. A note lay on the desk. It was written in the same ink she had signed the ledger with. "Welcome to the Endless Hotel. We hope you enjoy your stay." Episode 2, The Vanishing Floors. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the note in her trembling hands. The words seemed to pulse faintly, as if alive, but she blinked, and the illusion disappeared. Her heart pounded as the oppressive silence of room 307 pressed against her. She needed to leave. Grabbing her bag, Sarah ran to the door and flung it open. The hallway was different now. The wallpaper, once faded but intact, was peeling away to reveal wooden planks beneath. The sconces flickered erratically, casting strange shadows on the floor. And worse, the corridor seemed shorter than before, with the far end consumed by an impenetrable darkness. "This can't be real," Sarah muttered, stepping cautiously into the hall. The elevator stood where it always had, its metal doors gleaming faintly under the flickering lights. She pressed the button, but this time there was no familiar creak, no hum of machinery. The button didn't even light up. Her pulse quickened as the silence stretched. "Stairs," she whispered. She turned and hurried toward the stairwell door. Her hand froze on the handle when she heard it. A low, rhythmic tapping echoing from the far end of the hall. She spun around, her breath hitching. A figure stood in the shadows, too far to see clearly but close enough to make her skin crawl. Its head tilted unnaturally, as if studying her. The tapping grew louder, now coming from multiple directions. Doors along the hallway began to creak open, one by one. Panic surged through her. She yanked the stairwell door open and bolted inside, slamming it shut behind her. The tapping ceased, but the silence that followed was worse. It felt like the hotel itself was holding its breath. The stairs spiraled downward into a dim abyss. As Sarah descended, she noticed that the air grew colder, heavier. Her footsteps echoed strangely, sometimes overlapping, as if someone else were following her. She dared not look back. After what felt like an eternity, she reached another door. The plaque above it read lobby, and a surge of relief washed over her. She pushed it open and stepped into a hallway identical to the one she had just left. Room numbers lined the walls, and at the far end stood the same elevator. "No," she whispered, backing away. Her mind reeled. She was certain she'd gone down multiple floors. This couldn't be the same hallway. The sound of the elevator dinging snapped her attention forward. The doors slid open, revealing a yawning black void. The faint hum from earlier returned, louder now, resonating through her chest. Something inside the elevator shifted, a shape moving just beyond the edge of visibility. Sarah turned and ran in the opposite direction. The hallway stretched endlessly before her, doors on either side rattling violently as she passed. A low whisper followed her, growing louder with each step. Words she couldn't understand echoed in a language that sounded ancient, wrong. Her legs burned as she ran, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. She reached the end of the hallway and threw open the last door, desperate for escape. On the other side was a massive dining room, dimly lit by a single chandelier swaying gently above a long, ornate table. The table was set for a feast, but the food was rotting, covered in black mold and crawling with insects. A sickly sweet stench filled the air, making Sarah gag. Chairs lined the table, each one occupied by a shadowy figure. They sat motionless, their heads bowed as if in prayer. "Hello," Sarah's voice quivered. She took a hesitant step forward. None of the figures moved, but the whispers from the hallway followed her into the room, circling her like a storm. She edged toward the far end of the room, where another door beckoned. As she passed the nearest figure, she saw its head twitch. Her heart stopped as it slowly turned to face her. The shadow had no face, only a void where features should have been, yet she felt its gaze pierce through her. The other figures began to move, their heads lifting in unison. One by one, they turned toward her, their void-like faces staring as the whispers turned into guttural growls. Sarah bolted for the door, her body screaming in terror. She threw it open and slammed it shut behind her, leaning against it as she gasped for air. The growling stopped, replaced once more by an eerie silence. She was back in room 307. The bed was still neatly made, and her bag sat exactly where she had left it. The window, however, now revealed a vast, swirling storm, lightning flashing across a desolate landscape. On the desk lay another note. "You cannot leave, the hotel always finds you." Episode 3, The Heart of the Labyrinth. Sarah's hands trembled as she clutched the latest note. The words burned in her mind. "You cannot leave. The hotel always finds you." The storm outside the window churned violently, lightning illuminating twisted, shadowy figures that seemed to press against the glass from the outside. Desperation clawed at her chest. She paced the room, muttering to herself, "There has to be a way out. There has to be." Her eyes landed on the wardrobe in the corner, its door slightly ajar. It had been empty when she checked before. Now, a faint, eerie glow emanated from within. She approached cautiously, heart pounding. When she pulled the door open fully, she found a staircase spiraling downward. The glow seemed to come from deep below. A sense of dread washed over her, but she knew she had no choice. Staying in room 307 wasn't an option. The staircase seemed endless, the walls around her narrowing as she descended. The air grew heavy, filled with the metallic tang of blood. Sarah's footsteps echoed oddly, each one followed by a softer, delayed sound as if someone were following her. She didn't dare look back. After what felt like hours, she reached the bottom. Before her stood a massive iron door, its surface etched with strange, shifting symbols. The glow pulsed faintly from the cracks between the symbols, bathing the dark space in an unnatural light. Sarah hesitated, her hand hovering over the door. A voice whispered in her mind, soft and insidious, "Turn back. You're not ready." She ignored it and pushed the door open. The room beyond was vast, its walls curving upward into a dome that seemed impossibly high. The floor was made of polished black stone, reflecting the pale light of a single chandelier that hung from the center of the dome. Beneath the chandelier was a pedestal, and on it rested a book bound in what looked disturbingly like human skin. Sarah approached slowly, her footsteps echoing unnaturally loud. As she drew closer, she noticed the air seemed to ripple around the book, distorting her vision. She reached out, but before her fingers could touch it, the whispers returned, louder now, overlapping in a cacophony of unintelligible words. "Take it," one voice urged. "Leave it," another hissed. "You don't belong here," a third growled. Sarah clenched her jaw and grabbed the book. The moment her fingers made contact, a wave of cold shot through her body, and the room plunged into darkness. The chandelier extinguished, and the whispers turned into piercing screams. A faint glow returned, and Sarah found herself standing in the middle of the hotel lobby. But it wasn't the same lobby she remembered. The walls were cracked, the furniture rotting, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. The receptionist's desk was empty, and the front doors were gone, replaced by a solid black wall. Clutching the book tightly, Sarah turned in a circle, her breath coming in short gasps. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move, creeping closer with each passing second. She opened the book, desperate for answers, but the pages were blank. The only thing she found was a single line scrawled on the inside cover. "To escape, you must understand. To understand, you must remember." Images flooded her mind, fleeting glimpses of faces she didn't recognize, places she'd never been, and a sense of loss so profound it brought her to her knees. The book slipped from her hands, landing with a heavy thud on the stone floor. The shadows stopped moving, the air grew still. Slowly, Sarah stood, her mind spinning. She looked around the ruined lobby and noticed, for the first time, a faint light coming from a door she hadn't seen before. It was small, unassuming, and painted a deep red. She approached cautiously, the words from the book echoing in her mind. With trembling hands, she opened the door. Beyond it was a blinding white light. It enveloped her completely, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. When Sarah opened her eyes, she was lying on the side of an empty road. The hotel was gone, replaced by an expanse of dense forest. Her bag was beside her, and in her hand was the book, its cover now blank and unremarkable. A sense of relief washed over her, but it was fleeting. In the distance, she heard the faint sound of a bell, and her heart sank. She looked down at the book, now trembling in her grip. The hotel always finds you. The Demons Pact, Episode 1, The Desperate Bargain. Eli was only 10 years old when his world began to fall apart. His father's illness had left the family destitute, and his mother worked long hours at the factory just to keep food on the table. The once warm and lively home had grown cold and somber, the laughter of better days replaced by the heavy silence of despair. One night, as Eli lay in bed listening to the muffled sound of his mother crying in the next room, he made a decision. If no one could save them, then he would. He didn't know how, but he would find a way. The idea came to him the following day when he overheard the old man at the market whispering to a vendor. "The woods," the man said, his voice low and trembling. "There's something there. If you're desperate enough to ask, it'll answer." Eli's heart pounded as he listened. That night, after his mother had fallen asleep, he slipped out of the house and into the dark forest. The air was crisp and still, the silence broken only by the crunch of his footsteps on fallen leaves. The deeper he went, the darker it became. The trees loomed like shadowy sentinels, their twisted branches clawing at the starless sky. Just as fear began to take hold, Eli stumbled upon a clearing. In the center stood an ancient, gnarled tree with roots that clawed at the earth like talons. "Why have you come?" The voice was deep and resonant, echoing as if it came from everywhere and nowhere. Eli froze, his breath hitching in his throat. "I need help," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall and cloaked in darkness. Its eyes glowed like embers, and its presence filled the clearing with an oppressive weight. "Help comes at a price," the figure said, its voice smooth and chilling. Eli swallowed hard. "My father is sick. We don't have money for medicine. Please, I'll do anything." The figure tilted its head, a cruel smile curling its lips. "Anything." "How noble of you." It circled him slowly, the air growing colder with each step. Very well, I will grant you what you seek. Your father will be healed, your family will prosper, but in return, your life will be mine when the time comes. Eli's heart raced. He thought of his father, pale and weak, and his mother, worn and weary. He thought of the warmth their home used to hold, of the laughter that once filled its walls. I accept, he said, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at him. The figure reached out a hand, its fingers long and clawed. Eli hesitated for a moment before taking it. The contact was icy, sending a shiver down his spine. The figure's grip tightened, and Eli felt a searing pain on his palm. When he pulled his hand away, a strange mark was etched into his skin, glowing faintly before fading into a scar. It is done, the figure said, its voice filled with dark satisfaction. Your father will awaken healed. Your family's fortune will change. But remember, the debt will be collected. With that, the figure vanished, leaving Eli alone in the clearing. The forest seemed to exhale, the oppressive weight lifting as the night returned to silence. When Eli returned home, he found his father sitting up in bed, his cheeks flushed with newfound vitality. His mother wept tears of joy, embracing them both. The next day, a letter arrived with news of an unexpected inheritance from a distant relative, enough to secure their future. But as Eli watched his family's joy, he couldn't shake the chill that lingered in his bones. The mark on his palm throbbed faintly, a constant reminder of the bargain he had made. Deep down, he knew that his story was far from over and that the price of his desperation had yet to be paid. Episode 2, Shadows of the Bargain. Weeks turned into months, and Eli's family flourished. His father returned to work, his mother's smile grew brighter, and their home brimmed with laughter once more. The inheritance they received allowed them to move into a larger house and leave the shadows of their old life behind. But Eli could not forget the pact. The mark on his palm remained, a constant reminder of the price he had agreed to pay. At night, he would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering when the demon would come to claim him. One evening, as the family sat down for dinner, a knock echoed through the house. It was sharp and deliberate, sending a chill down Eli's spine. His mother went to answer, but when she opened the door, no one was there. Only a folded piece of parchment lay on the doorstep. Eli's stomach sank as his mother brought the parchment to the table. She unfolded it, her brow furrowing, as she read the strange symbols scrawled across the page. Eli recognized them immediately. They matched the mark on his palm. "What is this?" his mother asked, her voice tinged with unease. Eli took the parchment, his hands trembling. The symbols shifted before his eyes, rearranging themselves into words only he could understand. "The time approaches. Prepare yourself." He quickly crumpled the parchment, forcing a smile. "It's nothing, just a prank," he said, his voice betraying the fear clawing at his chest. His parents exchanged concerned glances but said nothing more. That night, Eli burned the parchment in the fireplace, watching the flames consume it. Yet the words lingered in his mind, growing louder with each passing day. Strange occurrences began to plague the family. Shadows moved where no light should cast them. Whispers echoed through the halls at night, too faint to understand but too persistent to ignore. Eli's parents dismissed them as imagination, but Eli knew better. The demon was watching. One night, unable to bear the weight of his secret any longer, Eli ventured back into the forest. The moon hung low, its pale light barely penetrating the canopy. He returned to the clearing, the gnarled tree standing as ominous as ever. "I know you're here," Eli called, his voice steady despite the fear in his chest. "What do you want from me?" The air grew cold, and the demon's figure materialized from the shadows. Its ember eyes burned with amusement as it regarded the boy. "You summoned me," it said, its voice like a low growl. "You struck the bargain. Do you now regret it?" Eli clenched his fists. "You said I'd pay with my life, but my family needs me." "Isn't there another way?" The demon's smile widened, revealing sharp teeth. "There is always another way, but every path has its cost." It circled him, its presence suffocating. "Serve me, and your debt will be postponed. I have tasks that require a mortal's touch. Complete them, and I may grant you more time." Eli hesitated. The thought of serving the demon made his skin crawl, but the alternative, leaving his family without him, was unthinkable. "What kind of tasks?" he asked cautiously. The demon chuckled, a sound that made the trees shudder, all in good time. For now, return home. Await my call, and remember, your actions will have consequences. Before Eli could respond, the demon vanished, leaving him alone in the clearing. The mark on his palm burned, a fiery reminder of the pact he could not escape. When Eli returned home, the house was eerily quiet. His parents were asleep, oblivious to the weight their son carried. As he lay in bed, staring at the mark on his hand, he realized that his life was no longer his own. The demon had claimed it, and the shadows were closing in. Episode 3, The Final Debt. Eli spent the following weeks in a state of constant vigilance, waiting for the demon's call. The strange occurrences in his home grew more frequent. Lights flickered inexplicably, objects moved on their own, and his parents' cheerful demeanor began to fade, replaced by unease and restlessness. Eli knew the demon's influence was spreading, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. One stormy night, as thunder rumbled in the distance, the mark on Eli's palm flared with an intense heat. He clutched his hand, pain coursing through him as the demon's voice filled his mind. "It is time, Eli." The voice echoed, cold and unrelenting. Eli rose from his bed and slipped out of the house, the storm's winds whipping at his clothes as he made his way to the forest. The clearing was as he remembered it, though the ancient tree now seemed to pulsate with a sinister energy. The demon appeared, its ember eyes glowing brighter than ever. "You have delayed long enough. Are you ready to fulfill your part of the bargain?" Eli swallowed hard. "You said I could serve you instead of giving my life. I'll do whatever you ask." The demon's smile was chilling. "Good. Your task is simple. Retrieve an item from the old mausoleum at the edge of town. Bring it to me, and I will grant you more time." "What kind of item?" Eli asked, his voice trembling. "You will know it when you see it," the demon replied cryptically. "But beware, for others guard at those who do not take kindly to intruders." Eli's journey to the mausoleum was fraught with fear. The storm's fury had only grown, and the night seemed unnaturally dark. When he arrived, the mausoleum loomed before him, its iron gates creaking in the wind. Taking a deep breath, he pushed them open and stepped inside. The air was thick with decay, and the faint glow of his flashlight barely penetrated the darkness. As he descended the stone steps, a chilling sense of dread settled over him. Whispers echoed through the halls, too faint to comprehend but unmistakably present. At the end of the corridor, Eli found a pedestal. Upon it sat a small, ornate box, its surface adorned with strange symbols. As he reached for it, the whispers grew louder, transforming into anguished cries. Shadows coalesced around him, taking on ghostly forms. "Leave this place," one of them hissed, its voice filled with sorrow and anger. "The box is cursed." Eli hesitated, his hand hovering over the box. "I don't have a choice," he said, his voice trembling. "If I don't take it, my family will suffer." The spirits surged closer, their forms flickering like dying flames. "The demon lies," another said. "The box will doom you all." Despite their warnings, Eli grabbed the box and turned to flee. The spirits' wails grew deafening as they gave chase, but as he burst out of the mausoleum, the storm seemed to swallow them whole. He ran back to the clearing, clutching the box tightly. The demon awaited him, its form towering and menacing. "You have done well," it said, reaching out to take the box. "Your time is extended." As the demon opened the box, a dark, swirling energy erupted from within. Eli stumbled back, watching in horror as the energy was absorbed into the demon, its form growing larger and more terrifying. "What did I just give you?" Eli demanded, his voice shaking. The demon's laughter was cold and cruel. "Power, freedom. You have served me well, and for that, I will keep my word. Your family will remain safe for now." Eli's heart sank. He had hoped that fulfilling the demon's task would free him, but he now realized that the pact had only tightened its grip. The demon vanished into the night, leaving Eli alone in the clearing once more. When Eli returned home, his parents greeted him with relieved smiles, unaware of the darkness he had unleashed. But as Eli lay in bed, the mark on his palm burned faintly, a constant reminder that his debt was far from paid. He had won a reprieve, but the shadows of the bargain would haunt him forever. The Crying Statue, Episode 1, The First Tears. The old manor house sat on the edge of town, shrouded in mist and surrounded by rumors. Most locals avoided it, whispering tales of hauntings and misfortune. At its heart stood a marble statue of a woman cloaked in sorrow, her delicate hands clasped over her heart, and her face tilted toward the heavens. The townsfolk called her the Weeping Lady. Anna had always been drawn to the statue. As an art student fascinated by history, she found the craftsmanship mesmerizing. She had spent countless afternoons sketching its details, from the intricate folds of the stone dress to the hauntingly lifelike expression of despair. But she had never visited the manor at night until now. It was a rainy evening when Anna decided to venture there, sketchbook in hand. The storm's rhythmic patter accompanied her as she made her way through the overgrown garden. Lightning illuminated the statue, casting long shadows across the courtyard. She hesitated, the air thick with an unexplainable tension. Just a quick sketch, Anna muttered to herself, pushing aside her unease. Setting up her umbrella, she sat on a nearby bench and began to draw. The statue looked almost alive under the rain, water streaking down its face like tears. Anna's pencil moved swiftly, capturing the scene. But as the storm intensified, she heard a faint, muffled sobbing. She froze, her pencil hovering above the paper. The sound was soft at first, almost indistinguishable from the rain. But it grew louder, unmistakably human. Anna's heart raced as she scanned the empty courtyard. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. The sobbing stopped. For a moment, only the rain answered her. Then, she noticed something that made her breath catch. The statue's face was different. The sorrowful gaze now seemed directed at her, and from the corners of its stone eyes, droplets fell, glistening in the dim light. "It's just the rain," Anna whispered, trying to convince herself. She approached the statue, her footsteps splashing in the puddles. Up close, the droplets on its cheeks looked thicker than water. Trembling, she reached out to touch one. The liquid was warm. Anna stumbled back, dropping her sketchbook. The sobbing returned, louder now, echoing through the courtyard. It seemed to come from all around her, yet nowhere at all. She looked up at the statue, and for the first time, she noticed the faint movement of its lips. They were quivering, as if trying to speak. A bolt of lightning struck nearby, illuminating the garden in a blinding flash. When the light faded, Anna saw a figure standing behind the statue. It was a woman, her face obscured by dark, wet hair, and her body draped in a flowing gown. The sobbing grew louder as the figure raised her head, revealing hollow, sorrowful eyes that locked onto Anna. Paralyzed by fear, Anna could only watch as the figure stepped closer. The rain seemed to bend around her, muffling the storm's noise. The woman's lips parted, and in a voice that was both a whisper and a wail, she said, "Why won't they let me rest?" Anna turned and ran, her feet slipping on the wet stone. She didn't look back, even as the sobbing followed her through the garden and into the streets. When she finally reached the safety of her apartment, she bolted the door and collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. Her sketchbook was still in the courtyard. As the rain continued to fall outside, Anna sat trembling. The woman's mournful eyes burned into her memory. She didn't know who the figure was or why she was tied to the statue, but one thing was clear: this was only the beginning. Episode 2, The Haunting Truth. Anna couldn't sleep. The events of the previous night played over and over in her mind. The sobbing, the warm tears on the statue, and the spectral figure, it all felt like a fever dream. Yet, the memory of the woman's hollow eyes was too vivid to dismiss as imagination. She resolved to go back to the manor, determined to uncover the truth. The next day, armed with a flashlight and her phone, Anna returned to the manor. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained overcast, casting a dreary pall over the old building. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. She hesitated at the gate, her heart pounding. "You can do this," she whispered to herself. Clenching her fists, she pushed the gate open, its rusty hinges groaning in protest. The garden looked different in the daylight, less menacing but still unsettling. The statue stood in its usual spot, its sorrowful gaze fixed upward, as if pleading with the heavens. Anna approached cautiously, her steps crunching on the gravel path. Her sketchbook was still where she had dropped it, lying open and soaked through. She picked it up, shaking off the water, and flipped to the page she had been working on. Her unfinished sketch stared back at her, but something was wrong. The face of the statue was different. Where she had drawn serene sorrow, There was now a twisted expression of anguish, the stone mouth opened in a silent scream. She gasped, nearly dropping the book. A sudden chill ran down her spine, and the familiar sound of sobbing reached her ears. It was faint but unmistakable, drifting on the wind like a distant cry for help. "Who's there?" Anna called out, her voice shaking. The sobbing grew louder, echoing through the garden. It seemed to be coming from the manor itself. Gritting her teeth, Anna turned toward the house. The door was slightly ajar, creaking as it swayed in the breeze. She hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside. The interior was dark and musty, the air heavy with the scent of mildew. Dust motes floated in the faint beams of light streaming through cracked windows. The sobbing continued, guiding Anna deeper into the house. She followed it up a grand staircase, her footsteps echoing in the empty halls. On the second floor, she found herself in a long corridor lined with portraits. The paintings depicted a family, a stern-looking man, a graceful woman, and a young girl clutching a doll. The girl's eyes seemed to follow Anna as she moved, their painted gaze unnervingly lifelike. At the end of the corridor was a door, slightly ajar like the one downstairs. The sobbing was louder now, coming from within. Anna pushed the door open, revealing a small bedroom. The furniture was covered in white sheets, and the air was colder here, biting at her skin. In the corner of the room stood a mirror, its surface fogged, as if someone had been breathing on it. As Anna approached, she saw words scrawled into the condensation. "Help me." Her reflection flickered, and for a brief moment, she saw the spectral woman standing behind her. Anna spun around, but the room was empty. The sobbing had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, startling her. She pulled it out to find a text from an unknown number. The message read, "Find the truth." Attached was a grainy photo of the statue, but the background was different. Instead of the manor's garden, the statue was surrounded by gravestones. Anna's hands trembled as she stared at the screen. She didn't recognize the cemetery, but she knew she had to find it. The answers she sought were there, waiting among the dead. As she left the room, the faint sound of sobbing began again, following her as she retraced her steps. When she reached the garden, she glanced back at the statue. Its face was serene once more, but Anna couldn't shake the feeling that its eyes were watching her. She stepped onto the street, the weight of the encounter heavy on her shoulders. The mysterious text and the image of the gravestones loomed large in her mind. The statue's secret was buried in the past, and Anna was determined to unearth it no matter what it cost. Episode 3, The Restless Spirit. Anna spent the next day poring over maps and local archives, searching for the cemetery from the photo. Her research led her to an abandoned burial ground on the outskirts of town, a place long forgotten by most. The cemetery had fallen into disrepair, its gravestones obscured by weeds and time. As dusk settled, Anna arrived at the site. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, and the shadows of gnarled trees stretched across the overgrown graves. She carried a flashlight, its beam cutting through the gloom, and the photo of the statue saved on her phone. The sobbing began as soon as she stepped into the cemetery, faint but unmistakable. It was the same mournful cry that had haunted her since that night at the manor. Following the sound, Anna navigated through the graves, her flashlight illuminating names and dates long faded. Finally, she found it, a small clearing with a single gravestone, cracked and weathered. The statue stood behind it, exactly as it appeared in the photo. But here, in the dim light of the cemetery, it looked even more lifelike, its sorrowful expression almost unbearable. Anna's heart raced as she approached the gravestone. The inscription was barely legible, but she could make out the name, Eleanor Grayson. Below it were the words, "Beloved wife and mother, taken too soon." A sudden chill swept through the air, and the sobbing grew louder. Anna turned to the statue, and her breath caught in her throat. The spectral woman stood beside it, her form translucent but undeniably real. Her hollow eyes met Anna's, and she spoke in a voice that was both a whisper and a wail. "You found me." Anna wanted to run, but her feet felt rooted to the ground. Gathering her courage, she asked, "Who are you? Why are you tied to the statue?" The woman's gaze softened, and tears streamed down her ghostly cheeks. "I was Eleanor. My husband, he created the statue after I passed." He said it was to honor me, but he trapped me here. Anna frowned. Trapped you? How? Eleanor's form flickered, and her voice wavered. He couldn't let me go. His grief turned to obsession, and he performed a ritual. Binding my soul to the stone, I've been here ever since, crying for release. Anna felt a pang of sorrow and anger on Eleanor's behalf. How can I help you? The ghost pointed to the gravestone. Break the bond. Destroy the statue. Only then will I find peace. Anna hesitated. Destroying the statue felt wrong. It was a masterpiece, a piece of history. But as she looked at Eleanor, her torment was undeniable. I'll do it, Anna said, her voice firm. She searched the cemetery for a heavy rock, her flashlight casting eerie shadows across the graves. When she returned to the statue, Eleanor's ghost watched silently, her expression a mix of hope and fear. Raising the rock, Anna hesitated one last time before bringing it down with all her strength. The sound of cracking stone echoed through the clearing. With each strike, the sobbing grew louder, turning into a crescendo of anguish. Finally, the statue crumbled, its pieces scattering across the ground. As the last fragment fell, the sobbing stopped. Eleanor's ghost began to fade, a serene smile gracing her face. Thank you, she whispered. I'm free. And then she was gone, leaving Anna alone in the silent cemetery. Anna stood there for a long moment, the weight of what she'd done settling over her. The air felt lighter, and the oppressive chill had lifted. But as she turned to leave, her flashlight flickered, and she heard it a faint sobbing, carried on the wind. She didn't look back. The book that writes itself, Chapter 1, the first entry. Leela had always been a book lover. Her small apartment was filled with stacks of novels and shelves bowing under the weight of her collection. When she stumbled upon the old, leather-bound book at the second-hand shop downtown, she couldn't resist. Its cover was blank, worn smooth by time, and the pages inside were yellowed but strangely empty. No title, no author, just blank parchment. It's an antique, the shopkeeper had said, his tone dismissive, as if he didn't care whether it sold. But there was something about it that drew Leela in, something she couldn't explain. That night, after placing the book on her nightstand, she fell asleep quickly, the cool autumn air lulling her into a deep slumber. The next morning, as the soft light of dawn filtered through her curtains, she noticed something odd. The book was no longer blank. Leela picked it up, her hands trembling. The pages now contained writing, elegant, flowing script that hadn't been there the day before. Leela closed the shop door behind her, clutching the old book to her chest, unaware of what she had brought home. Her breath hitched. That was exactly what had happened the day before. She turned the page, her curiosity battling with unease. As she slept, the book sat on the nightstand, waiting, watching. A chill ran down her spine. She flipped through the remaining pages, but they were blank. Only the first two had writing. It's just a coincidence, she whispered, trying to convince herself. Yet, as the day wore on, her thoughts kept drifting back to the strange, impossible words. That night, Leela placed the book on her desk, far from her bed, and went to sleep with the lights on. But when she awoke, the book had moved. It was back on the nightstand, as if it had never left. Her heart pounded as she opened it again. More writing had appeared, the script as elegant as before. Leela woke to find the book where it had been all along. She didn't realize that by opening it again, she was inviting it closer. She slammed it shut, her breath coming in short gasps. Her apartment felt colder, the shadows in the corners darker than they should have been. Leela tried to ignore the book, stuffing it into a drawer and piling heavy books on top. But that night, her dreams were filled with whispers, soft, insistent voices calling her name, urging her to read. When she woke, the drawer was open, and the book sat on her nightstand once more. This time, the entry was different. Leela, you can't hide from me. Her blood turned to ice. She stared at the book, her mind racing. What had she brought into her home? She decided to leave, shoving the book into a bag and rushing out the door. But as she stepped into the hallway, she felt the weight of it in her hand, heavier than before, almost pulsing with a life of its own. Leela didn't know where she was going, but one thing was certain: this book wasn't just telling her story, it was writing it. Chapter 2, the new chapter. Leela sat in a small corner booth at a 24-hour diner, her hands gripping a cup of lukewarm coffee. The book sat on the table before her, its worn leather cover as unassuming as ever. Around her, the hum of casual conversation and the clink of cutlery against plates provided a fragile sense of normalcy. But she couldn't stop glancing at the book, her unease growing with each passing minute. She had tried to leave it behind. She left her apartment without a plan, throwing the book into her bag and telling herself she'd find a way to get rid of it. But something about it compelled her to stop here. It was as if the book wanted her to stay. With trembling hands, she flipped it open. More text had appeared since she last looked, the same elegant script filling the pages. Leela sat at the diner, her coffee growing cold. She opened the book despite her fear, her curiosity overpowering her caution. Her breath caught. It was describing her now. She turned the page, but the rest remained blank. The ink felt almost fresh, the letters gleaming faintly under the fluorescent lights. A sudden, sharp knock on the window beside her made her jump. A man stood outside, his face obscured by the glare of the streetlights. He wore a heavy coat, and his hat was pulled low over his brow. Leela's heart raced as the man pointed toward her, then to the book. She quickly snapped it shut, her pulse pounding. The man didn't move, standing there as if waiting for her to respond. Gathering her courage, she motioned to a passing waiter. "Excuse me," she said, her voice barely steady. "Do you know that man outside?" The waiter glanced toward the window, his brows furrowing. "What man?" he asked. Leela turned back, but the man was gone. She felt a chill run down her spine. "Never mind," she murmured, shaking her head. The waiter walked away, leaving her alone with the book once more. For the rest of the night, she resisted the urge to open it again. Instead, she stayed at the diner until dawn, surrounded by the noise of strangers. When the sun began to rise, she made up her mind. She needed to destroy the book. Later that morning, Leela stood by the edge of the river, clutching the book tightly. She had chosen this spot because it was secluded, the rushing water muffling all other sounds. With a deep breath, she hurled the book as hard as she could. It splashed into the river, sinking out of sight. Relief flooded her. She turned to leave, her footsteps crunching against the gravel path. But then she froze. The book was there, lying on the ground in front of her. Its cover was dry, as if it had never touched the water. "No," she whispered, backing away. "That's impossible." She didn't dare touch it this time. Instead, she turned and ran. The image of the book burned into her mind. When she returned to her apartment hours later, exhausted and shaken, she found the book waiting for her on the kitchen table. A new entry had appeared. "You can't escape me, Leela. We are bound now." Leela sank to the floor, her head in her hands. The book wasn't just writing her story anymore, it was controlling it. And she had no idea how to stop it. Chapter 3. Bound by Ink. Leela sat in the dim light of her apartment, the book open before her on the coffee table. The words on the pages had multiplied overnight, filling in with a story that mirrored her every move. It was no longer just observing, it was dictating. Leela sat alone in her apartment, the air thick with dread. She tried to think of a way out, but the book already knew her thoughts. She snapped the book shut, her hands trembling. "No," she whispered. "You don't control me." The apartment felt oppressive, the walls closing in. Shadows stretched unnaturally long in the corners of the room, as if the darkness itself were alive. The book seemed to hum faintly, an almost imperceptible vibration that made her teeth ache. She needed help, someone to verify what was happening, someone to prove she wasn't losing her mind. Digging her phone out of her pocket, she called Daniel, an old friend, who was always skeptical of anything supernatural. "Leela, what's wrong?" Daniel asked, his voice warm but cautious. "I need you to come over," she said, her voice shaking. It's hard to explain, but I need you to see something." "Okay, I'll be there in 20 minutes." The line went dead, and Leela stared at the book. She didn't dare open it again, but she felt its presence, almost as if it were breathing alongside her. She placed it in a drawer and locked it, hoping that would be enough to contain whatever force it held. 20 minutes stretched into 30, then 40. Lila paced the room, glancing at the clock every few seconds. Finally, a knock came at the door. She rushed to open it, relief flooding her at the sight of Daniel. "Sorry I'm late," he said, stepping inside. "Traffic was terrible." "Thank you for coming," Lila said, motioning him toward the living room. "It's this book. It's writing things about me, about what I'm doing." Daniel raised an eyebrow but followed her. "A book is writing about you. Are you sure you're not just imagining things?" She pulled the locked drawer open and retrieved the book. Handing it to him, she said, "Read the last entry." Daniel opened the book and scanned the page. His face, initially amused, turned pale. This is what you just told me, word for word." "I told you," Lila said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's alive, Daniel. It knows everything I do." Daniel closed the book and set it on the table. "Okay, maybe it's some kind of elaborate prank. A hidden camera or voice-activated device. There has to be a rational explanation." Before she could respond, the book flipped open on its own. Pages turned rapidly, stopping near the end. New words appeared on the blank pages, forming before their eyes. "Daniel will try to help, but he will fail. And soon, he will join me in the ink." "What the hell?" Daniel whispered, stepping back. "Did you see that?" Lila nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "This is what I've been dealing with." The room grew colder, and the lights flickered. A low, guttural sound filled the air, like distant whispers layered atop one another. Daniel grabbed Lila's arm. "We need to leave, now." They headed for the door, but the whispers grew louder. The shadows in the room seemed to reach for them, stretching out like black tendrils. The book slammed shut, the sound reverberating like a gunshot. Daniel yanked the door open, and they stumbled into the hallway, but something was wrong. The corridor seemed longer than usual, the walls stretching into darkness. The air was heavy, almost suffocating. "This isn't right," Lila said, her voice trembling. "This isn't real." A voice echoed behind them, deep and resonant. "You cannot run from your story." Lila turned, and the book was there, floating in the air, its pages fluttering wildly. A figure began to emerge from the pages, dark and shapeless, its eyes glowing faintly in the gloom. Daniel stepped in front of Lila. "Stay back," he shouted, but his voice wavered with fear. The figure extended a shadowy hand, and Daniel froze, his eyes wide with terror. Ink began to seep from his skin, his body dissolving into dark, swirling liquid. He let out a choked scream before vanishing entirely, absorbed into the book. Lila fell to her knees, sobbing. The figure loomed over her, its voice filling her mind. "You belong to me now. Write your story, or I will." The book fell to the ground, silent and still. Its cover gleamed faintly, the name Lila Carter now etched into the spine. Rambling, Lila picked it up. The pages were blank again, except for the first line of a new chapter. Lila sat alone, the weight of her destiny pressing down upon her. She knew there was no escape. The Abandoned Asylum, Chapter 1, Echoes of the Forgotten. The rain pelted down on the cracked asphalt, a relentless symphony against the broken windows of Blackthorn Asylum. Once a sprawling facility, it now loomed in decay, its Gothic spires piercing the stormy sky. Ivy choked the crumbling walls, and faded warnings adorned the locked gates. Condemned and do not enter. But curiosity had a way of ignoring warnings. Maya adjusted her flashlight, its weak beam slicing through the suffocating darkness. She tightened her grip on her camera bag. "One quick look," she muttered, as if convincing herself. Just enough to get a few shots and prove the stories wrong. The stories. They whispered of shadows that moved on their own, of disembodied cries echoing through the empty halls, and of a sinister presence that had driven away even the bravest trespassers. Yet here she was, stepping past the rusted gates, her heart hammering with a mix of fear and determination. The entrance hall greeted her with an overwhelming stench of mildew and rot. Broken furniture and shattered glass littered the floor, and graffiti scrawled in frantic handwriting covered the peeling walls. Some messages were vulgar, others chilling. "They're watching, leave now, no escape." A sudden creak echoed through the vast hall. Maya froze, her breath hitching. "Just the wind," she whispered, though her voice sounded hollow even to her own ears. Her flashlight beam wavered as she scanned the room. The large double staircase at the center of the hall seemed to invite her upward, but the shadows seemed thicker there, almost alive. The sound of her camera's shutter was jarring in the silence. She snapped another picture of the graffiti-covered walls, trying to ignore the oppressive weight of the building. As she turned toward a corridor, the beam of her flashlight caught something that made her stomach twist, a handprint. A fresh one, smeared across the dusty wall. "Hello," Maya called, her voice trembling. She was met with silence, but the air seemed to thrum with a low vibration, like an unspoken threat. Ignoring the prickling on the back of her neck, she moved forward. The corridor stretched endlessly, its dim light flickering from the few remaining bulbs. The air grew colder with every step, and the whispers began soft, indistinct murmurs that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Her camera's flash went off as she captured the eerie scene. The photo preview displayed something that made her blood run cold, a faint silhouette standing at the end of the corridor. But when she lowered the camera, the figure was gone. "It's just your imagination," she told herself, though her legs felt like lead. She reached the door at the end of the corridor, its paint chipped and handle rusted. A faint sound came from behind it, a soft, rhythmic tapping. Heart pounding, she pushed the door open. The room was empty. Broken chairs and a toppled filing cabinet were its only occupants. Yet the tapping continued, louder now, echoing from somewhere above. Her gaze was drawn to the ceiling, where she saw something that nearly made her scream, a pair of eyes staring down at her through the cracks in the plaster. They blinked, and then they were gone. Maya stumbled back, her breath coming in gasps. The whispers grew louder, merging into a chorus of mournful cries and angered shouts. She turned to run, her flashlight flickering wildly. As she reached the entrance hall, the large doors slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping her inside. For the first time, Maya realized the stories weren't just tales. Blackthorn Asylum wasn't abandoned, not completely. Something lingered here, watching her, drawing her deeper into its web, and it wasn't going to let her leave. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Dark. Maya's pulse thundered in her ears as she pressed herself against the cold, damp wall of the asylum's entrance hall. The massive doors loomed behind her, sealed shut as though by some unseen force. She had tried everything to open them, pushing, pulling, even throwing her full weight against them. Nothing worked. She was trapped. "Calm down," she whispered to herself, though her voice trembled. "There has to be another way out." The tapping sound that had unnerved her earlier now seemed to follow her, growing fainter and louder in a strange rhythm, as if it were toying with her. She gripped her flashlight tightly and turned back toward the corridor. The whispers were softer now, but they lingered, just audible enough to make her skin crawl. "Hello," she called out, her voice shaky. It echoed through the vast emptiness of the asylum, only to be swallowed by silence. Then, a faint reply, a child's laugh, distant but distinct, her stomach clenched. She moved cautiously down the corridor, the beam of her flashlight dancing across the walls. The handprint she had seen earlier was gone, replaced by a smear that looked like it had been dragged toward the nearest doorway. Maya hesitated but stepped inside. The room appeared to be an old office, with a desk overturned and papers strewn across the floor. On the wall, a corkboard still held faded photographs and notes. One photo caught her eye, a group of smiling doctors and nurses standing in front of the asylum. But their faces seemed wrong. The smiles were too wide, the eyes too dark. As she reached out to touch the photo, the whispers returned, louder and closer. They were no longer indistinct, they formed words now, phrases that chilled her to the bone. "You shouldn't be here." Maya spun around, her flashlight catching movement in the corner of the room. A figure stood there, shrouded in shadow, its head tilted unnaturally. She stumbled back, her breath caught in her throat. The figure took a step forward, and the dim light revealed its grotesque form, a man in a tattered, orderly uniform, his face gaunt and hollow, his eyes sunken and lifeless. "Who are you?" Maya managed to choke out, but the figure said nothing. It only stared, its mouth slowly stretching into an unnatural grin. She turned and bolted from the room, her footsteps echoing in the empty halls. The whispers followed her, rising to a cacophony of voices pleading, angry, and sorrowful. The asylum seemed alive now, its walls vibrating with an energy that made her skin prickle. She didn't dare look back. Maya found herself in a stairwell, the metal steps spiraling downward into darkness and upward into dim light. She hesitated, her flashlight flickering again. The tapping sound returned, this time from below. Her instinct screamed at her to climb, to get as far away from that sound as possible, but something compelled her to descend. Each step creaked under her weight, the sound amplified in the suffocating silence. The whispers grew fainter, replaced by a low hum that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. She reached the bottom and found herself in what looked like a basement storage area. Rusted gurneys and broken medical equipment littered the space. At the far end, a large steel door stood ajar, a faint light spilling from within. Maya's heart raced as she approached the door. The hum grew louder, almost deafening, and she could feel it vibrating in her chest. She peered inside and froze. The room was filled with rows of hospital beds, each occupied by a figure covered in white sheets. The figures were motionless, but the air was thick with the sensation of being watched. She took a cautious step inside, her camera raised. As the flash illuminated the room, the sheets began to stir. One by one, the figures sat up, their faces obscured but their heads all turning toward her. The whispers returned, now a single, unified voice. "Stay with us." Maya's scream echoed through the basement as the steel door slammed shut behind her. Chapter 3. The Final Echo. Maya's scream faded into the heavy silence of the asylum's basement. The steel door behind her was sealed tight, and the figures under the sheets began to rise fully from their beds, their movements unnervingly slow. Maya backed away, clutching her flashlight, its beam trembling as much as her hands. She stumbled into a gurney, the metallic clang echoing through the room. "What do you want?" she shouted, her voice cracking. The figures stopped. One of them tilted its head, as though listening, before lifting a skeletal hand to point at her. The whispers returned, not as a cacophony this time, but as a singular voice that filled the room, dripping with malice. "Finish it." "Finish what?" Maya's voice was barely a whisper now. Her back pressed against the cold steel door, her mind racing. Then she saw it, a black notebook lying on the ground beneath one of the hospital beds, its cover stained and worn. It seemed to pulse faintly, like it was alive. Compelled by some unseen force, Maya inched forward. Her trembling fingers reached for the notebook. As soon as she touched it, a searing pain shot through her hand, and the whispers became deafening. "You must see." Images flooded her mind, doctors and nurses performing cruel experiments, patients crying out in agony, the asylum's walls soaked with suffering. She saw the man from the photograph, his twisted smile frozen in place as he watched the torment unfold. Then, she saw herself, standing in the very room she was in now, holding the notebook. The vision ended as abruptly as it began, leaving her gasping for air. She opened the notebook with trembling hands, flipping through pages filled with scrawled notes and disturbing sketches. One entry caught her eye, written in jagged handwriting. "The ritual is incomplete. One must remain to contain the darkness." Maya's heart sank. She realized the truth. The asylum's horrors were not random. They were the result of a failed ritual meant to seal away the malevolent force within. The whispers grew louder, urging her, guiding her. She looked around the room and spotted an old, rusted scalpel on a nearby tray. As her fingers closed around its handle, the figures under the sheets began to chant, their hollow voices uniting in a haunting melody. The steel door creaked open behind her, revealing the corridor bathed in an eerie, pulsating light. "No," she muttered, shaking her head, "there has to be another way." But deep down, she knew there wasn't. The asylum demanded a sacrifice. With tears streaming down her face, she stepped back into the corridor. The whispers guided her to the stairwell, and she climbed, each step heavier than the last. When she reached the top floor, she found herself in the clock tower she had seen earlier from the outside. The massive clock face glowed faintly, its hands frozen at midnight. In the center of the room stood an ornate chair, surrounded by symbols carved into the floor. Maya approached it, the notebook growing heavier in her hands. As she sat down, the whispers ceased, replaced by a profound silence that pressed against her ears. She placed the notebook on her lap and closed her eyes. The asylum shifted around her, the walls trembling as though the building itself was alive. The figures in the basement dissolved into mist, their chants fading into nothingness. Outside, the first rays of dawn pierced the horizon, bathing the asylum in an unnatural light. When Maya opened her eyes, she was no longer herself. Her body sat motionless in the chair, her face serene but empty. The notebook lay closed on her lap, its purpose fulfilled. The asylum had claimed its guardian, and the darkness was contained once more. But far below, in the depths of the basement, a faint tapping began anew.
If you enjoyed today's story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel, Mystical Tales, so you won't miss out on more eerie and thrilling tales in the future. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.